For decades, there's been one question that has followed Linux like a shadow, no matter how far it has come, no matter how powerful it has become, no matter how many servers, supercomputers, smartphones, and embedded systems it has conquered. That question is simple but brutal. Has Linux finally lost its biggest weakness? To understand why this question even matters, we need to go back to what that weakness actually was, how it shaped Linux's reputation, and why so many people dismissed Linux on the desktop for so long despite its obvious technical advantages. Linux was never weak in performance, stability, or security. Those were always its strengths. The weakness was something far more human, far more emotional, and far harder to fix. Usability, compatibility, and the fragmented experience that made normal users feel like outsiders in a world built by and for enthusiasts. For a long time, Linux felt like a system that demanded respect before it offered comfort. You had to learn its language, understand its logic, and accept that things would not always work the way you expected. Hardware support could be hit or miss. Popular software often required workarounds or simply didn't exist. Games were an afterthought. Professional creative tools were either missing entirely or lagging far behind their Windows and macOS counterparts. Even when Linux could technically do the same things, the path to get there was often confusing, inconsistent, or intimidating. This wasn't because Linux was poorly designed at its core, but because it evolved in a decentralized way, driven by communities with different goals, priorities, and philosophies. For the average person, the biggest weakness of Linux was not the terminal, not the package manager, and not even the learning curve. It was trust. People didn't trust that Linux would work reliably for their daily needs without constant tinkering. They didn't trust that their printer would function, that their Wi-Fi would stay connected, that their favorite applications would be available, or that updates wouldn't break something unexpectedly. Linux earned a reputation, fair or not, as a system for people who enjoyed fixing problems rather than avoiding them. And once a reputation like that forms, it can take decades to undo. But something has changed slowly at first and then all at once. The modern Linux desktop no longer feels like a collection of compromises. It feels increasingly complete. Hardware compatibility has improved dramatically, especially thanks to better kernel support, vendor cooperation, and initiatives like firmware integration and standardized drivers. Wi-Fi, Bluetooth, GPUs, and power management are no longer the minefields they once were. Major manufacturers now ship laptops with Linux pre-installed, not as a novelty, but as a serious option. This alone signals a shift in how Linux is perceived by the industry. Software availability, once the most obvious weakness, has also transformed. The rise of cross-platform development frameworks, web-based applications, and containerized distribution formats has changed the rules entirely. Flatpak snap and a pimage may still spark debate within the Linux community, but from a user perspective, they have removed enormous friction. Installing complex applications no longer requires hunting through repositories, adding PPAs, or compiling from source. One click is often enough. Updates are safer, rollbacks are easier, and dependencies are no longer a nightmare. This doesn't just make Linux easier to use, it makes it predictable. And predictability is one of the most underrated features in any operating system. Gaming, once considered Linux's Achilles heel, has undergone perhaps the most dramatic turnaround. The introduction of compatibility layers that translate Windows games into Linux native experiences without requiring developers to do extra work has completely changed the conversation. What was once impossible or impractical is now a routine. Thousands of games run flawlessly, often with performance that rivals or even exceeds Windows. Anti-cheat systems, once a hard stop, are increasingly supported. Game launchers, controllers, VR headsets, and peripherals now work with minimal effort. For many users, gaming was the final reason to stay on Windows, and that reason is steadily disappearing. Professional software tells a similar story. While it is still true that some industry standard tools remain exclusive to other platforms, the gap is narrowing. Alternatives have matured, workflows have stabilized, and compatibility layers allow many proprietary applications to run well enough for real work. More importantly, entire industries are shifting toward platform-agnostic tools. Video editing, 3D modeling, audio production, and software development increasingly rely on applications that treat Linux as a first-class citizen. In some cases, Linux is actually the preferred platform due to its performance, scripting capabilities, and integration with modern pipelines. The desktop environments themselves have also evolved. Modern Linux desktops no longer feel like experimental projects. They're polished, coherent, and thoughtfully designed. Animations are smooth, layouts are intuitive, accessibility features are improving, and customization is no longer mandatory to achieve a usable system. You can still tweak everything if you want, but you don't have to. This is a crucial distinction. Choice is powerful, but only when it doesn't overwhelm the user. Linux has learned, sometimes painfully, that freedom without guidance can feel like chaos. Updates, another historical pain point, are now far less risky. Immutable systems, snapshot-based updates, and atomic upgrades mean that breaking your system is no longer the default fear. You can update confidently, knowing that rollback options exist. This is something many mainstream operating systems still struggle to provide in a transparent way. Linux has quietly solved a problem that others are still wrestling with. So, does this mean Linux has finally lost its biggest weakness? The answer depends on how we define that weakness today. If the weakness was usability for non-technical users, then Linux has made enormous progress. If it was software availability, the situation is better than it has ever been. If it was gaming, the transformation is nothing short of historic. If it was hardware compatibility, Linux is now good enough that most users will never think about drivers at all. In these areas, Linux is no longer playing catch-up. It is competitive and, in some cases, leading. But there is another layer to this question that often gets ignored. Linux's biggest weakness may never have been purely technical. It may have been perception. The idea that Linux is not for normal people still lingers, even when reality no longer supports it. Perception changes slowly, especially when alternatives are deeply entrenched. Windows and macOS benefit from decades of familiarity, marketing, and institutional adoption. Linux, by contrast, relies on word of mouth, community advocacy, and gradual exposure. Ironically, this is where Linux's success in other domains might finally tip the scales. People already use Linux every day without realizing it. Their phones, their routers, their TVs, their cars, their cloud services all run on Linux. The idea that Linux is exotic or dangerous becomes harder to maintain when it is already everywhere. As users become more comfortable with open source software and platform independence, the mental barrier to trying Linux on the desktop weakens. At the same time, the computing landscape itself is changing. The importance of the traditional desktop operating system is declining as more work moves into browsers, containers, and remote environments. This shift favors Linux. When the OS becomes a stable, efficient base rather than a lockdown ecosystem, Linux's strengths shine. Its flexibility, transparency, and control stop being niche features and start being advantages. That doesn't mean Linux is perfect. Fragmentation still exists, and it always will to some extent. Some workflows still require compromise. Certain hardware vendors remain uncooperative. Some user experiences are still rough around the edges. But perfection was never the goal. The real question is whether Linux has crossed the threshold from good for enthusiasts to good enough for everyone else. And increasingly, the answer looks like yes. The biggest weakness of Linux was that it asked too much of its users. It asked them to adapt, to learn, to troubleshoot, and to accept limitations in exchange for freedom. Today, Linux asks far less. It still offers freedom, but it no longer demands expertise as the entry fee. You can install it, use it, work on it, play on it, and update it without feeling like you're participating in an experiment. That alone represents a fundamental shift. So has Linux finally lost its biggest weakness? Maybe the better question is whether that weakness even exists anymore in the same form. What was once a glaring flaw has become a minor inconvenience, and what was once a deal breaker is now a matter of preference. Linux hasn't changed overnight, and it hasn't abandoned its principles to achieve this progress. It is maturity, more than anything else, is what makes Linux in its current form feel different from every version that came before it. For the first time, choosing Linux is not primarily an ideological decision. It is a practical one, and when an operating system reaches that point, it has already overcome its greatest weakness, whether people realize it yet or not.